and it's fun to see how history does affect a lot of these things, because obviously cultural things that were happening in the world were affecting the styles of what women were wearing, what men were wearing. Hi, this is Kristi Widmar, and I'm here with my sister Katrina from Rasmussen Diamonds. We wanted to just kind of have a little bit more of a fun podcast today and talk about historic jewelry and the history of jewelry. This tends to be the time of the year when we get all the new shows on TV, and there's been a lot of historic pieces, and we do know that there's obviously so much cultural things that affect jewelry styles throughout all of the decades, centuries even. And so, we see a lot of unique pieces that come through. We've had experience with some really cool, unique historic pieces over the years. And so we thought it would be fun to touch on some of the history of jewelry. So, in fact, you were just saying the other day how right now red carpet is having a resurgence of historic jewelry and lots of glam.
Absolute glam, absolutely. Go on.
Yeah. So, all of those things that you're starting to see, maybe this will give you a little insight as to why this particular style is, popular or has become popular. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to my sister Katrina is, usually the one that does the buying and helping out with brokering if we find some unique pieces. And she's been able to really gather a lot of good information on the historic pieces. So I'm going to let you do like a little brief overview.
Okay.
I think.
I think it's important to kind of know a little bit about the periods in jewelry and the fact that they're very much dictated by, throughout history, by the royals and the elite, kind of dictated the styles of jewelry because they were the ones that could afford the big jewelry. And as you can see today, if you look at the red carpet, that's exactly what's happening as well.
Yeah.
We've got some big jewels we want to talk about on the red carpet, but let's just talk about history for a second. First of all, if we kind of look back at the history of jewelry, we have a number of different periods that you can see. And if we watch period pieces, we can kind of watch for the accuracy of that jewelry. That's one of the things I tend to do. Mm-hmm. The Georgian period actually is characterized by King George I through the 4th.
Okay.
And the Georgian period extends from 1714 to 1837. Sorry, I have to check my notes on this one here.
Right.
But when it comes down to it, at that time, you could actually look further back in history, but at that time we were seeing actual jewelers and craftsmen making pieces for the royals at that time.
Okay.
You were going to see a lot of older cut stones. They didn't have the technology that they have today. Right. You're going to see a lot of pieces that are kind of lightly hammered gold, a lot of hand fabricated pieces and things like that. So not a lot of that period jewelry does still exist, but if you do find it, it can be a real remarkable piece.
Yeah.
Not a lot of it's in great shape. The Victorian period was characterized by Queen Victoria from 1837 through 1901.
Okay.
Queen Victoria had a very long reign, as you can see, just like Queen Elizabeth.
That's right,
yeah.
I know.
And the royals today, we look at their jewelry quite a bit. Queen Elizabeth was known for her jewelry.
For sure.
But Queen Victoria lost her husband fairly early on in her reign.
And they were very much in love.
Yes, she was so in love with him. And a lot of her jewelry was what we call mourning jewelry. And for a long period of time, she wore a lot of dark jewelry, a lot of symbolic jewelry, things that were had meaning behind it. Most of the jewelry was very yellow gold, even some rose golds. And then they would actually take gemstones and use the gemstone. The first letter of that gemstone would actually be the letter that they were using to spell out a word, like precious or beloved.
Yeah.
So that was just kind of a unique aspect of the Victorian period.
We've seen some of those pieces come through where you'll get, like kind of an odd combination of colored gemstones, but like you said, it was the first initial of each gemstone that would spell out something.
Yeah.
And so we've seen some
pearl,
of those.
And then you would just kind of go down the line, R for ruby, E for emerald, and you'd be like, why are these in this sequence? Because they're actually spelling out a word.
Yeah.
So after the Victorian period, then there's the Edwardian period.
Before you do that,
yes,
I want to touch on the one thing that I thought was crazy about the Victorian period, unless you're going to say it's an Edwardian, but I'm not positive.
Go for it.
Is the hair jewelry.
Oh yes, that was totally Victorian.
So
I forgot about
crazy. They did jewelry made out of beloved's hair. So if someone passed, they would take their hair and they would weave it like super, super intense weaving. And we've even seen some of these pieces. So you're talking about late 1800s, up to 1901, where this hair jewelry was made. And we've actually seen some come through in estates. And they're still in good shape. I mean, it's a little, it's a little weird, a little creepy. But intricate as can be. It's unbelievable. And they just, I mean, you've seen it.
Yeah, we had a ring not too long ago. I think it was just last year, and it was not too wide of a ring, but they actually had the hair kind of inlaid almost in the ring in a very, very tight braid or plait, you know. It was quite interesting, but yeah, hair jewelry is definitely something that was used during that period.
A lot of this stuff really, I mean, obviously when Queen Victoria and her husband was alive, it was very lavish. It was, you know, there was a lot of intricate design to the details, but it really shifted into, for a long period, a lot of that kind of dark mourning jewelry. And so that's very indicative of that time period of the things that we see that would come through. And so, that's anything that would symbolize a loved one.
In the mourning period, the mourning jewelry was actually one of the reasons why the Edwardian period was ushered in, because the Edwardian period kind of started before Queen Victoria's death. It's often referred to also as the Belle Epoque era, but Prince Edward, he was the trendsetter, and they were a little tired of wearing all the mourning jewelry, all of the royals, and following Queen Victoria, so they started following Prince Edward. And the 1890 through 1920s is when this Belle Epoque period, and this was characterized by platinum. Most Edwardian jewelry is done in platinum or white gold, lots of diamonds. Colored gemstones were really not seen a whole lot in the Belle Epoque era. Real big sprays of big diamonds and things like that. And this was typically only worn by the elite. So if now people are looking at the elite and seeing this big diamond jewelry and they're going, that's completely unattainable to me. So what was the answer to that? Well, the answer actually was what we call the Art Nouveau jewelry period. And the Art Nouveau period is also known in the arts worlds as the arts and craft period as well. And Art Nouveau kind of overlapped almost entirely with the Edwardian period. It was the 1890s through 1915, okay? So Art Nouveau was light and airy and asymmetrical and inspired by nature, and they used a lot of enamel and color.
And butterflies.
Yep, exactly.
Fairies and
things
lots
that
of
you
enamel.
would not see at all in the Edwardian jewelry. So it's kind of like, this is your jewelry for you, but we want something that's a little bit different over here. And the jewelry that survives from the Art Nouveau period is absolutely stunning. There's some really beautiful artistry there, and they're in essence like a work of art. They're not as reminiscent of what we sometimes consider traditional jewelry. A little bit more like art, little pieces, mini pieces of art,
mosaics,
as opposed to your typical
stained glass window looking type of things. A lot of brooches and it's definitely some very unique things that would hand down to your generation and to generation, and it would be a very much of a statement type of piece of jewelry.
I'd love to see more Art Nouveau pieces in here. I don't see them very often, but when I do, I'm always in awe, especially if they're really in good shape. That's a tough one.
There are one or two designers still to this day that will create pieces that are similar in that Art Nouveau style.
Plique-à-jour. Remember that one?
Yeah.
Plique-à-jour basically means light of day, and it's basically a type of enamel that you can see through, and it's more like a stained glass window. And that's kind of almost a lost art, but you'll see there are some designers or artists who are using this technique still.
Yeah. But then it goes into my favorite. I love the Art Deco period.
The actual dates for the Art Deco period are 1920 to 1935.
That
basically
architectural
in between the wars.
Is that totally 1920s. You know, you can totally envision the Roaring 20s and how everything, the women's dresses were these straight line dresses. They had long necklaces. Everything was very architecturally based and lots of geometry. Chrysler Building.
Yes.
There you go.
That's kind of the very epitome of the Art Deco period.
Yeah. And we actually do see a lot of that, and we do see a lot of replication of that today. We're starting to see a lot of designers today coming up with styles that have a lot more of that. They would be more like the baguettes, the long rectangular gemstones that are added into things. A lot of symmetry,
yes.
A lot of geometry, design.
A couple things about the Art Deco is that during that time period, the Russian circus came and we were fascinated by it here. We're starting to open up to a lot of different cultures and stuff. And at that time, they had the primary colors were used. They had reds, blues, and greens. So in the Art Deco jewelry, they took those colors, and we'd see a lot of blue sapphires, red rubies, and really beautiful green emeralds. But interestingly enough, even though these pieces of jewelry might be made out of platinum and filled with beautiful diamonds and everything, diamond cutting was a kind of newer technology, was allowing us to have different cuts of diamonds. But most of the time, those reds and blues were actually lab-grown reds and blues, because they had been growing rubies, sapphires, and emeralds. Well, rubies and sapphires all the way back into the 1800s is when they started growing them synthetically or in a laboratory, and then emeralds in the early 1900s. So they actually were able to cut them, and they didn't have to worry about weight loss or anything like that, or really precious gems being destroyed trying to create unusual shapes to fit into these beautiful geometric designs. So those are the three main colors that we'd see in the Art Deco pieces.
Yeah, definitely. And then, you know, the interesting thing is, like you said, kind of between the wars. So we do know that there was, and it's fun to see how history does affect a lot of these things, because obviously cultural things that were happening in the world were affecting the styles of what women were wearing, what men were wearing, definitely affected these things. And men were still wearing jewelry. It did shift. I think we kind of missed that in some of what we were talking about, but it did shift. There were a lot of men. It was mostly men in nobility and the aristocracy that were wearing jewelry. The women weren't quite as much. And the interesting thing is it started with a couple different things. The engagement ring.
The engagement ring dates back way further than anything that we've been talking about so far.
Right.
The first engagement ring was made in 1477. It was commissioned by Archduke Maximilian of Austria, and it was for his betrothed, Mary of Burgundy. And because of that, a lot of the aristocracy and the elite, they looked at that and they said, oh, well, we need to do that too, obviously. And so imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and this is basically where our engagement ring started, all the way back in 1477. But again, as Kristi had said, there was a long period of time where men were wearing more jewelry than women, and women were the ones that eventually turned it into the opposite direction. Most men today would probably not believe that there was a period of time where women rarely wore jewelry, and it was the men who were going to the jewelry stores and filling themselves with jewels.
Yeah. But going back then to the Art Deco period, men were still wearing, I mean, it became cufflinks and tie tacks and tie bars, but you didn't see as much of the, you know, extravagant jewelry any longer. On men, of course, they weren't wearing, you know, the
big
bigger
long
pieces and stuff like that.
pendants and the
brooches
and all of that, yeah.
So it did shift, and of course the war did affect a lot of things. You know, they started making pieces out of paste, and you know, they were really everything was affected by the war, of course. And so things started to shift and become a little bit more modest as we move into the next generation. And this is where we start to see a lot of jewelry that comes through our doors when we look at the in antique and vintage jewelry.
So retro period is the area during the war, World War II, obviously, but also all the way up to the 60s. So 1930 to 1960 was the retro period. The retro period is where we started to see, Art Deco was still a lot of platinum and white gold, but the retro period is where we started to see gold come back, the gold color, yellow gold, rose golds even. And we would see these big, broad pieces that really represented a lot of gold. We'd see some really interesting shapes of gemstones. Again, technology kind of improves the way that we can make jewelry. And so the retro period, I always like to think of it as, think of the glam age of Hollywood in like the 1940s to maybe 1950s. I think that kind of represents a lot of what we would see in the retro jewelry. There were, you know, at this time we now have well-established Tiffany's, Van Cleef & Arpels and Cartier, and they had been established since basically in the 1800s and everything like that, but they were the powerhouses behind that Hollywood glam elite. And because the United States didn't have nobility to follow, we found ourselves following the
Hollywood
movie stars. As soon as there
Hollywood
were movie
nobility.
stars, that was our nobility pretty much.
Yep.
So and to this day, you know, we're going to talk a little bit about that
Absolutely.
stuff. So before we get into the modern jewelry and kind of the resurgence of the glam in the modern era, I wanted to ask you a question because you had an opportunity I wish I had had.
It was amazing.
Oh my goodness. You were working at Molina Fine Jewelry in Arizona,
Yep.
and you had the opportunity to see some of the jewels that were recovered from the Titanic.
I did.
Tell me a little bit about that.
So they had a traveling museum exhibit that was starting at the museum in Phoenix, and the divers that actually were recovering a lot of the pieces that they were starting to put together for this exhibit came to my boss, Al Molina, and said, hey, you know, we've got all these jewelry items. Do you think you guys could appraise them? Which of course is kind of an odd thing, because how can you really appraise something that has that historic significance? But we did, and at that time I was in charge of setting up the appraisal appointments and kind of assisting the appraiser with things. So we set up a time, we brought everything into our lab, basically had, you know, this kind of a U-shaped lab, and everything was just set out and numbered. And my job was to go and catalog everything. I had to weigh and measure and just kind of brief description of everything, and then the appraiser would come in and he would take everything and start to do the actual evaluation of the pieces and, you know, testing the stones and testing the metals. And so I was in this lab kind of by myself for a little while. It was this air of, I had goosebumps the whole time. I can't even explain it. It was just really cool. But the interesting thing is it's not as glamorous as you would think, because of course everybody thinks of, you know, the glamour. You watch the Titanic movie and all of that, but most of the pieces that survived were not first class pieces.
Well, okay.
Right?
So you didn't find the heart of the ocean.
No heart of the ocean. In fact, that doesn't actually exist.
I know.
But there were some interesting pieces. There was an engagement ring. There were a couple of rings, a lot of pins, a lot of like hair pieces and hat pins. Most of it was gold filled. There were broken chains, and you know, a lot of it was really nondescript. And honestly, if somebody were to bring those pieces in today, asking if we could do appraisals or asking, you know, hey, this was in Grandma's jewelry box, what is it? We'd say, well, it's junk. You know, it's gold plated or gold filled. It's worth very little. But because of the historic significance of these pieces, it was really, I don't even know how we were able to evaluate any of that, to be honest, and that wasn't my part of the job, but I remember discussing it with the appraiser, and you know, usually at that particular case, you go off of what has been found or what's been sold at auction that has something of the same significant historic
Yeah, that's kind of how you have to do it. It's tricky because
it's really
whenever you have provenance involved, it really has to do with that.
Yeah.
It's more about that than it actually is about the nuts and bolts or the gold and diamonds that put a piece together, basically. Yeah. It's all about really where it came from and the fact that it came from one of the most famous ships, well, probably the most famous ship out there, and came from the bottom of the ocean as well. So
1917, I think, is when it went down.
So that's a pretty cool thing to have been a part of there.
Yeah. That was definitely.
Was there one piece that stood out at all for you in that?
Not really.
No?
I'm sorry, I can't tell you. You know, maybe we can grab some pictures and show some of the pieces that were found, but nothing that really, you know, would be like, oh my gosh, this was so cool. It was so unique. They were pretty much common items that you would have found probably from that era.
They still have a lot more value because they went down with the Titanic.
Right,
that's
really
for sure.
cool. It was such a cool experience.
That's cool.
One of the other things that I thought was neat there was the owner owned a very historic diamond as well, called the Archduke Joseph diamond. That was a 76.5 carat, colorless, flawless diamond. It was owned by the Archduke Joseph of the Habsburg family, and it was an emerald cut. I would say it was about that big.
Pretty big diamond.
We had it set in platinum, and we had a necklace that it could come on and off of. Fun thing about that, my boss used to basically, he would show it off. He'd go to a lot of charity events, or he'd go and see some of his guests in different cities, and he would bring it with him and he'd carry it in his pocket. We used to call it his pet rock. It was $27 million diamond, just the diamond.
So a $27 million pet rock.
Pet rock, yeah.
Very cool.
Yes.
All right. When you were talking about the Archduke Joseph diamond.
Uh-huh.
One of the things that I loved about it is that if you went to the store and asked, you could try it on and have your photo taken of it.
Yes.
So I'd love for you to show the photo that you have of your daughter, Mara, who
Okay.
just graduated high school,
Yes.
wearing the
She just
Archduke
turned
Joseph.
18.
And how old was she when she
She was
wore
about
it?
7 months old, so we went back to go visit because we did move, obviously, back to Wisconsin. But we went back to Arizona to visit, and we stopped at the store, and I had my 7-month-old little girl with me, and they said, well, we need to put the Archduke Joseph on her. So I have a picture of my I'm surprised she didn't take it and put it in her mouth like a pacifier. It was about that size. So yeah, that was fun.
That's cool.
Like I said, you don't really get a whole lot of people wearing that stuff now, although he did sell that. It did sell at auction. But like we said in the beginning, resurgence right now in Hollywood. We're starting to see some really cool Hollywood glam again. And a couple years ago, Lady Gaga wore the Tiffany diamond 128 carat yellow Tiffany diamond, and she was like the third person to wear it.
Yeah.
And they said it was about $30 million. And you know, that kind of set a precedence. We just really, when you start to see the Oscars, the Emmys, we're just on big jewelry coming out. We're seeing a lot of these jewelry houses pulling out things from the vaults.
Beautiful big diamond necklace all the way around with multiple different shapes. These great Art Deco looks are kind of coming back with a lot of baguette diamonds and things. You're seeing layers of diamonds. It's just the glam that's going on the red carpet right now is so cool. So watch for it. You're now at this point in time when they have everyone kind of commenting on people's dresses and stuff like that. There's an entire different segment here in the jewelry industry where all the talk is about the jewelry that's going on. And the dresses, although they're very important and they pair very well, the jewelry is a big part of that look that you create for that red carpet. So when it comes to history and jewels, I think that the history of what's happening right now is going to be seen in the future and talked about, the type of jewels that are being seen on our Hollywood elite, our own personal royalty, basically, are basically the people that are out there in front of the cameras.
Yes.
Yeah.
And as you're watching your fall shows and all of the historic pieces, or all the historic shows that are out there, look for what they're wearing. You definitely see their cultural things, and maybe you'll see a few pieces that will kind of tie into some of the genres that we've just talked about from the different eras.
And if you have a unique piece, come in and have us take a look at it. I'm always interested. I myself am the appraiser here at Rasmussen's, and I love appraising older pieces. We also buy too, so that's kind of a fun part of it as well. So I like to always put that little plug in there.
So thanks for listening.
Yes,
If you have any questions, call us up. We love to talk jewelry.
Yes, we do.